and what a proud heritage we have as Sri Lankans to be able to say that we were a nation self-reliant and dependent only on ourselves to fulfill our agriculture needs. Agriculture is a sector that has spiraled into the spotlight, especially due to COVID-19 induced supply chain problems, and with so many people having to stay at home and shipping lines around the world getting chock-a-blocked with various supply chain and logistic problems, the need for a country to be able to satisfy their own agricultural requirements has been not this important since, I would say, the last pandemic centuries ago. But let's talk about the Sri Lankan context. A country with a proud heritage of agriculture, reservoir systems that continues to marvel people who observe it even today. Where are we in this sector? Have we gone wrong at a particular point? In the modern day and age where technology seems to be coming forward, have we adopted the right technologies to this sector, or have we done the grave mistake of trying to leave it behind and move forward? Millions depend on this sector, even in Sri Lanka. Globally, this is an industry worth more than $2 trillion. What is the way forward for the Sri Lankan agriculture sector? Let's talk about that today and more in Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. I'm Tharindu Amarasekara, and joining me for today's discussion is an expert, a veteran in the field of agriculture and agri-sector, who is none other than Rizvi Zaheed, the chairman of the Sri Lanka Agri-Entrepreneurs Forum. Rizvi, welcome to Bisnomics. It's an absolute pleasure to have you.
Thank you. Great pleasure and nice to be here.
Rizvi, let's talk about the agriculture industry of Sri Lanka. Now, there are various measures towards this, but globally when we speak about this, how big is this sector? And in Sri Lanka, what is the contribution of agriculture to our economy?
Globally, if you look at the share of agriculture to global GDP has always been on the decline for more than one reason, and one is that globally, because of labor availability, people have moved from agriculture, but agriculture has remained very important globally, even though it accounts for 4% of global GDP. That can vary from 4% in some of the very developed countries to around 25% in less developed and developing country contexts. But if you look at Sri Lanka, and I'd like to go there straight away, because Sri Lanka has an amazing agricultural tradition which dates back, as you said, to ancient times. We have an amazing strength in the biodiversity of Sri Lanka. We can grow crops across the year, around the year.
Around the country?
Around the country as well, even though we have arid zone, semi-arid, dry zone, wet zone. There are crops that can be grown quite successfully in those zones.
So, I just want to add a little twist here to you. Now, they say the soil in Jaffna, it's sometimes they say it's harsh conditions, but still the onions coming from there are delicious.
Absolutely, because the agronomy is such that you have day-night temperature variations, and they are also growing potatoes in Jaffna now. And because of a lot of ingenious work done both by the people and as well as the researchers in agriculture. But coming to Sri Lankan agriculture, even though we are only 65,000 square kilometers of land, we have about 2.3 million hectares of land that is agricultural, of which of course about 80% accounts for non-plantation crops. Of course, when the British came in here, we converted and developed a lot of our lands, previously coffee lands, into tea and rubber, and of course then coconut.
Cinnamon, etc.
As well, yes, of course, those are, a lot of them are home garden, but the non-plantation part of the agricultural sector accounts about 80% of the agricultural land. Now, that's where the heart of agriculture in Sri Lanka dominates. That's the rice, the non-food, the other field crops, the maize, the various types of other agricultural crops, the spices, of course.
Correct.
And these crops are grown either in two seasons, in keeping with the weather patterns, the Yala and the Maha season, and some of the others are also perennial, like some of our spices grown around the year, and interesting new crops as well.
So, let me get this right. When you say non-plantation, we are talking about these family-owned lands where the family is running a particular paddy field and they've been running it for generations, that kind of land.
Yes, exactly. And
so
that
80%
again,
is that?
No, 80% of the total 2.5 million hectares is this kind of lands. But of that, as you said rightfully, the majority is under 2 hectares in the average holding. So, there is no real commercial scale agriculture possible in the conventional way. But that does not mean
that it's not important.
That is not important, and that does also not mean that we should have, historically speaking, modernize our agriculture. Unfortunately, for one reason or another, which we can explore going forward, we have not kept pace with modernizing that part of our agriculture because of the technology issues and other factors, and as a result we became a very subsistence oriented agricultural production nation even into the modern day, even though lots of efforts have been made to improve that. So, Sri Lanka, when you talk about size, it is quite significant because there are economies of scale which can be done by getting farmers to agglomerate together. Even though the holdings are small, there are innovative concepts of bringing nucleus farms, outgrower systems which have come in. So, we can really realize the full potential. Most important part of agriculture in Sri Lanka is the food security aspect, and this is something that has something to be focused on. Even agriculture policy has focused on that as well, is that we have to produce food. We have to use the agricultural land to produce food for our people. That's paramount from a food security point of view, and together with that the nutrition security, because we need to get balanced diet as well going. And importantly, we have to provide incomes, because more than 30%, of course various estimates are there on the actual number, varying from 25 to 30% of Sri Lanka's workforce is involved in agriculture, and that's very significant.
And that's, we are talking about, I believe, more than 2 million people are involved in the farming, and we are talking about a sector, Rizvi, which contributes to more than 7% to our GDP.
Exactly.
It's been on the decline as well.
Yes.
But let me also ask you now, a country with a proud heritage, the Granary of the East, and we always speak about how all these massive scale agriculture systems were in place. Even the culture of Sri Lanka, in Sinhalese we say Vavai Dagabai, or in other words, even the ancient kingdoms always focused on building the reservoirs for the paddy and then also the temples. And these were the paddy was the reservoir, the paddy, these were cultural symbols of prosperity of this country. Now, from a heritage of that towards a country that is involved in importing massive volumes of food, did we go wrong somewhere?
We have done some things right, some things we have done well, but overall, as you have rightly alluded to, there are certain things that I would not say that we did wrong, but we did not do well enough. So, let me start with some of the positives, that from the food security point of view and the fact that Sri Lankan staple food is rice, we have been reasonably very successful with developing adequate rice, and which comes from the paddy. So, to such an extent that where rice and paddy is concerned, we do not have to import, except when we have adverse weather conditions in the past, in the last 5 years, I think it is once or twice that we had to import paddy. But apart from that, paddy has been very much, we have been self-reliant, and we have been able to grow our own paddy. Now, the reasons for that is because over the years, since the time of the Green Revolution, which started hitting Sri Lanka from the 70s onwards, we have been able to, in a very focused way, where the government played a key role, the Department of Agriculture, in bringing high yielding varieties of paddy, parent stock from the International Rice Research Institute in the Philippines, and the government scientists and the research stations, and the investment in agriculture research. This I am talking about in the 70s and onwards, was very intense, and as a result, we have been able to get yields up into an extent where we can be proud of. Really 4.7 metric tons per hectare for paddy is quite a good result. So, unfortunately, where we have failed is that Sri Lankans can't only eat rice, and today we know that we have an issue with nutrition and balanced diet as well.
About carbs, etc. There's a lot of talk about it.
Exactly. Yes. So, we have not kept pace with the development of the rest of the agricultural crops. For example, the vegetables and the fruits, and even the grains and the pulses, and even things like the chili and the potatoes and the onions went into a state of neglect, and there I think we did not do enough.
We lost the opportunity.
We lost the opportunity.
Rizvi, I want to also ask you now, a lot of people say, hey, wait a minute, how can you say that rice is unhealthy and all, because our ancient ancestors, all they ate was rice, and look what they did. But having said that, they did not have these very sedentary lifestyles. I mean, they would eat the rice, but they would get to the fields, they were involved in a lot of manual work, whereas unlike the modern times, there is a lot of office work, and as you very correctly said, that is where the whole focus towards vegetables and other alternative food has come in. But we didn't invest enough in those lines.
Exactly, yes. And one of the key issues is with regard to these other crops, that is the fruits and the vegetables, the pulses and the grains, etc., is that we didn't get the right cultivars, in meaning the right planting materials, the right seeds, and there were a lot of facilitation that required to be done, and that if you can say were some of our negatives. We put a lot of work on rice, and again, as you said, rice, you made a very valued point, is that the quality of rice that our ancestors ate was the traditional rice. So, those had low GIs, they were very healthy and all of that. But when population increased and the need for food security became paramount, the task for the breeders and the people who were involved in the rice sector in particular was to get the quantities, the yield per hectare up, so that we can feed the people. So, those varieties were not as, if you want to call it, healthy as the varieties that our ancestors ate. So, we produced a lot of other varieties, large volumes, but we had people to eat, there was no hunger and they ate the rice. But on the fruits and vegetables, the insufficient amount to research at the same tempo that paddy had, if we had kept it, we wouldn't have lost the trick there.
Understood, Rizvi.
As well as a lot of intervention was required on the part of developing those, a lot of research requires to be done, facilitation to, even if we could not produce those planting materials. For example, we have done quite well with some varieties of vegetables which have been imported, like hybrid seed varieties, but local seeds also have been developed, but not adequate to get the yields up, to make the outputs volume large, so that it can be affordable. In recent time, we see some positive trends, but that is something that we have to see how it goes going forward.
On a quick note, I want to ask you, this whole shift towards service economy and the talk about the importance of developing services, has it meant that from economic perspective, we are paying less attention to the agriculture sector?
Yes, I think that is a very good point, and I know along the way over the last 3 decades, our focus, probably maybe from the 1970s onwards, mid 1770s, the 1970s onwards, the focus towards the service economy, towards manufacturing, industrial rate growth, which is to be a mantra at a period in time in our modern history, resulted in the neglect of agriculture. And I will give some simple examples. We had a very strong agricultural extension capability, which means to take agricultural technologies to farmers. So, we had a service capability, we had a lot of farmers on the field, and we had a lot of extension workers doing that. Now, that died down because of the shift in focus towards the service economy, and a lot of those agricultural interventions got reduced.
Noted. What policy decisions are needed to strengthen the agriculture sector of Sri Lanka? Let us talk about that on the other side of this short break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics, your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. I am Tharindu Amarasekara. Now, the focus today is on the agriculture sector, and we are discussing that with a veteran in the field, someone with decades of experience in this industry, Rizvi Zaheed. Rizvi, let us talk about the key issues that the agriculture sector is facing. And time to time, we see this popping up on various platforms, economic platforms and forums, political platforms and forums, we see this popping up. What are the burning issues that our agriculture sector is facing? Because not a day goes by where we don't see farmers talking about their problems, and sometimes when they try to openly talk about their problems, they are being labeled as saying, okay, they are doing it for political gains, etc. But I strongly believe that there are genuine problems that the poor farmers, the farmers who have fed this nation, are actually facing now. And I don't think any farmer would encourage their children to get into farming because of this problem. And that's one of the first steps, in my view, towards an industry getting weaker and weaker and weaker. What are the real burning issues that our agriculture sector is facing right now?
Let me start with a broader macro issue that needs to be addressed very quickly, and that is one of land. As you know, Sri Lanka does not have a big extent of land, but we have land that's good arable land that can be done. It so happens that the bulk of that land is in the hands of the government, in state agencies, etc., nearly about 70%. So, that has to be released and made available. So, as I said, there is a small amount of land under 2 hectares owned by the farmers, and we will come to that in a minute. But unless we make available for commercial farming, so that we can shift the agriculture paradigm from subsistence farming, to commercial farming, we need to get economies of scale,
Correct.
which mean we have to have land of about 10, 20, 50 hectares, 100 hectares being made available to agripreneurs or agricultural entrepreneurs who can come from the farming class as well. They are making money, and it is an incentive for them to invest if they can come together and get into investment, and a lot of modern ways of financing agriculture are being available, from startups to various types of crowd funding, etc. So, we have to address the issue of land, and I think the key issue is for government to facilitate through either a land bank, which is something which we in the agriculture sector have promoted for a long time, to make agricultural land readily available to any investor who wants to invest in agriculture, value-added agriculture. Now, the Mahavali is doing a lot of work, and I think we are moving in the right direction. It's just that we have to up the tempo so that we can catch up for lost time.
So, what you are saying is, right now if someone wants to get land for agriculture purposes, there is a lot of restrictions and problems.
Yes, there is a lot of issues in getting the land. It's, you have to go and get to the various agents. It's surprising that some of the interesting parcels of land in Sri Lanka are owned by the railway, through the railway reservations, etc. So, we have to cut through that, and there are some attempts being made to do that. The Mahavali and the other authorities directly involved with agriculture are making available those. Having said that, the key pain points for agriculture in Sri Lanka is that we need to get technology. Technology meaning agriculture technology.
Agritech.
Agritech, yes. Starting with the planting materials, because the heart of agriculture is the seed. And unless you get the seed or planting material right, that will bring the highest yields and an economic yield, and the farmer will know how to manage it, and you need the right technology for that. We need to have the agronomy for growing the crop. How do you fertilize the crop? How do you make sure that the seed, which is costly, that you plant, gives the yield that is optimum, and then the farmer can get a produce that is large. So, we need to have the technology in, ranging from the seeds and planting materials, which has to be facilitated by government policy as well, because currently all imports of planting materials are governed by an approval process which is controlled by the relevant government agencies. So, that has to be fast tracked and facilitated to make it easier. The amount of bureaucratic processes has to be cut down, and that is agriculture policy's responsibility, and that is being addressed.
Yes.
This is again we need to fast track that. So, that is important agritech. Even in the case of mechanization of agriculture, and we know, as we all aware, the paddy sector contributed substantially, not only from the high yielding varieties, but also the mechanization, because paddy had a huge shortage of labor, because people not wanting to go into agriculture, the farmers' sons want to migrate and come to urban context. So, shortage of agricultural labor for harvesting.
And I think we as a country, we fail to recognize the farming community also, isn't it? I mean, if you take some of the countries like New Zealand, you see how the milk farmers, how they are recognized.
Absolutely.
And when if you are a farmer's wife, for example, there is a lot of prestige in the society, whereas we do not see the same thing in Sri Lanka. So, as you very correctly said, that had led to a lot of labor moving away from this sector.
Yes, and that can be addressed. Maybe I will come to that in a minute. But with regard to what is required for the removal of the pain points is the technology, the mechanization of agriculture. Like from paddy, we have started using combine harvesters, modern equipment technology. Even in the other areas, the greenhouse technology, protected agriculture, which is only beginning to come in here, but it has to be speeded up, and we have to support it. Now, countries like India or Bangladesh have done a lot with balancing their subsidies by putting a lot of money into these new modern ways of growing crops in greenhouses and various types of modern agriculture systems, drip irrigation systems, and the world has developed. Countries like Israel and Australia and, as you said, New Zealand have done that, and it is available for us.
And we are going to actually talk about the technology aspect more as well. Rizvi, this is a topic that has taken off once again in the political sector as well as in economic aspects about this fertilizer. Now, there are different sides to it, but I want to know your honest thoughts on this matter. What do you think about all this hullabaloo?
Tarindu, I think personally, and even from a point of view, somebody is involved in agriculture for over 3 decades, you have to be careful about the environment. Otherwise, if you do not do sustainable agriculture, there won't be an agriculture to grow in the future to achieve all these high goals of getting income for farmers and high yields and food security. So, we have to take care of the environment, and most of the agriculture inputs can be used carefully. The issue arises when you abuse it. And Sri Lanka has been the huge subject of abuse of the applications
overuse
of fertilizer.
Of some of these.
Absolutely. Sometimes well-meaning, the subsidy was meant to support farmers, but that also resulted in a heavy overuse and abuse of those. So much so that the whole agriculture ecosystem has got used to using chemical fertilizers and chemical crop protections, etc. But in the modern day, you can't do without it. Even if you have to go away from it, it has to be done in a phased out manner.
Correct.
So that we develop the right cultivation system, we develop the right planting materials, so that we can reduce the dependency on chemical fertilizer. And I think it is possible to very easily halve the chemical fertilizer use in Sri Lanka if by simply doing away with the subsidy, for example. You immediately almost halve the amount of chemical fertilizer that comes into the country, and that will force people to look for alternatives. And already I know for sure from trials I believe that the Department of Agriculture has done in its research stations, by using 50% of organic fertilizers as well as the inorganic, you can get the same yields. So, it is just that we need to have a glide path to go there.
Correct.
And we need to be aware, whilst the ban is something that has to be addressed.
Yes.
The sudden ban is what is something
has
that
put
can
a
pose
lot of people into difficulties.
That can pose. It might compel innovation, but I know institutes like the Sri Lanka Institute of Technology that introduce slow moving. In fact, I was also responsible to help to introduce a slow moving urea fertilizer, which are all in the right direction, but unfortunately
it takes time to come to a
yes,
point.
and also you have to look at it inwards as well. People involved in agriculture, from the scientists, etc., didn't speed up, didn't up the ante with regard to developing non-chemical fertilizers and crop protection, because it was easily available, it was subsidized.
Yes.
There was a kind of apathy towards developing, but I am all for moving away very rapidly as soon as possible. It is a question of time.
Noted. Rizvi, let us talk about global shortages. Now, we are talking about a banana shortage coming up worldwide, and there is so much of concerns regarding food security. From a global perspective, any truth to all these things that we are talking about? Because I think especially once countries realize that all of a sudden if there is a lockdown and if there are logistical problems, that they can't rely on other countries to provide food for them, that has made them, or that has rather got them thinking on this matter as well. But are we looking at any impending global food shortages in the near term?
Traditionally, Tarindu, global food shortages have been driven by about 4 or 5 factors. One, of course, is the conflicts that arise across the world, where land available for cultivation gets affected. Economic crisis causes various issues that curtails production and supply chain, and the most important one is adverse climatic factors and weather that simply takes away thousands if not millions of hectares away from food. So, that causes the shortages, and in recent times things like the pandemic have seriously affected supply chain. So, that even as you say, if somebody wants to transport bananas or pineapples even from within Africa, from Kenya to Uganda or vice versa, there are issues and there can be shortages, but there are essential commodities and grains that people depend on which can never be in shortage, because that can result. Now, currently as a result of various types of shortages, nearly 150 million people around the world are facing acute food shortage issues. So, that is there, and of course, across various crops, as you said, some horticultural crops, bananas, etc., these can arise. But the key issue is how do we ensure that people, where you can store the crops, that you can maintain buffer stocks even in the production location. And in Sri Lanka, we have good examples. For example, the pumpkin. We have huge oversupply of pumpkins that come in, and a large amount of that is thrown away and wasted. The tomatoes similarly. So, it is related to a whole ecosystem. If you want to avoid the food shortages and global food shortages, even countries like Africa are developing simple devices like solar based village level storage units, where they can keep food agriculture produced. Bangladesh has a good system which I have seen for storage of all the surplus potatoes. So, they keep it in what is produced in one season is kept and released to the market over several months. So, Sri Lanka also needs to go there. Globally, for some of the grain crops, that is there, but unfortunately there are the big players involved. So, people hold on to inventory, and currently because of the pandemic there is a tendency to, if you can call, people building up buffers. So, that drives for some of the grain crops and even the other food crops, sugar. So, as you are right, it is very dynamic with regard to the shortages of food. Now, for example, in India you see if there is droughts, they have a huge problem until recently about onions. So, that produces a lot of issues. In Sri Lanka, we have a problem with chili. We consume a lot of chili, so we don't produce any chili anymore.
Are we still suffering with this oversupply of pumpkin? Is that problem still a major problem?
It's still chronic because we have not addressed the storage issue.
Okay.
And one important thing which I have to mention here is that in Sri Lanka, we have to get our farmers and the whole agricultural ecosystem to grow to a market. We have been very much production oriented.
Produce what we can.
Produce what we can. We have got good land here, and we have started a agricultural production village here. Everything is production, a production outfit here to improve production. Even though we improve production and productivity, if you can't market it.
If you can't sell it.
Exactly. For that, you need some good, and again, this is one of the other pain points. We don't have a good agriculture ERP in order for us to give signals to the farmer. And today, you can use new technology like smartphones and various agricultural apps to provide information of what to grow, when to grow, and where you can market it. So whether in Sri Lanka or for value addition for export markets. So these are interesting thoughts that can help to reduce the impact of these food shortages globally, that you need to build up buffers, be self-reliant, so we don't have to be dependent on imported foods, critical items that we might require for the people in Sri Lanka.
Some very valid thoughts there, Rizvi. What are the opportunities for Sri Lankan agripreneurs, especially in terms of capturing the export markets? Let's talk about that on the other side of this short break. This is Bisnomics. Welcome back to Bisnomics. I'm Tharanu Amarasekara. Our focus today is on the agriculture sector. The Sri Lankan agriculture systems that are in place, is it sufficient to meet the current dynamic demands of a local and global market? And most importantly, what kind of policy decisions can we take to strengthen this sector? After all, we were the Granary of the East, and we do have a proud heritage of this industry. Rizvi, now we spoke about some of the issues, we spoke about the economic contribution. Let's talk government policy, because the agriculture sector is a vital element, I believe, because for so many generations and years, there is a big political impact as well. You don't want to get on the wrong side of the farmers, and at the same time, there is so many people who are dependent on this sector for employment. Do we have a proper government policy for growing the agriculture sector?
We have had agriculture policies.
Had,
yes, and it had been for time buckets and time periods.
So every 5 years we hit the restart button.
Exactly.
No long-term sustainable one.
Exactly.
Not a good way.
Not a good way, because for agriculture, Tharindu, you need to have consistent policy that covers a whole large time period, say 3 or 4 decades, because you need to do with agriculture. It's a growing science. There is art and science as well, but you have to have science to grow the crops, to develop the system, and you have to develop crops over a long period of time. It's not easy to develop an agricultural value chain, and that's the question I'm going to come to in a minute. So we need to have consistency in agriculture policy, which is something that Sri Lanka lacks. There have been stop-start agricultural policies, and then at various times Sri Lanka contends between the issue of cost of living versus support for farmers.
The subsidies and all that.
Exactly. So you bring in the issue of the levies on potatoes and onions in order to have cost of living, the objectives realized to address. On the other side, you have to have policies that give sustainable incomes to farmers. If farmers don't get sustainable incomes, how are they going to generate surpluses that they can keep aside and use for new technologies and reinvest in agriculture? Savings of farmers is zero. They are continuously in debt. The access to finance is an issue. So the policy must address a consistent way in which agriculture can be developed, where farmers can get incomes consistently, that they have faith in the crops that they want to grow, and that they will have support whenever it is required. We are also trying hard to develop an agricultural insurance scheme, which Sri Lanka does not have. All the various government policies have tried to address it. So consistency is key, and a key element of that consistency is with regard to facilitation. Now, what does facilitation mean in the agriculture sphere? Is that we have to ensure that the policymakers and policy facilitates the continuous introduction of improved varieties of planting materials. If we have one variety of a planting material that is bringing in yield of so much, for example, if you look at papaya, we have one variety which is called red lady that provides a particular yield. So, if you look at some of the other crops or the vegetable crops, we get different types of yields, whether it is the brinjals or whether it is pumpkin or the watermelon. So, we have to continuously bring in new varieties to improve the yield, so that continuously farmers can get. So, for that the policy has to make it easy to bring these new varieties to market. So, it has to be in terms of facilitation, money has to be put into R&D. If it is not possible to do the R&D in the side of government, then the policy must facilitate private research or any kind of engagement. So, that must be very clearly spelled out, that all these facilitation to bring in new varieties must be made easy. The other key one is the facilitation to provide some of the public goods. Now, Sri Lanka can't afford right now huge storage facilities. So, we must have good models. For example, as I said, in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka also there was one model that was experimented with in terms of the Damula storage facility, where farmers can come in and even regionally rent out storage, so that they are not buffeted by price fluctuations and they have good returns continuously. So, there has to be policy support from the point of view of government to encourage public private partnerships in a very aggressive way, provide the incentives for investment in that area and encourage these interventions. As I said, there were two key ones. One was with regard to the planting materials and the other one was regard to storage. But across that, there are many other areas in which agriculture innovation can be encouraged by providing tax incentives for research. There was a time when we had a 300% tax deductibility for research R&D into agriculture in particular as well. So, some of these need to be fine tuned on and off. The main thing is it has to be consistent, support the farmers, support them with price support mechanism if necessary, but make it consistent.
And you can't be hitting the restart button or the reset button every 5 years.
Exactly.
And this is a common problem, I think, not only the agriculture sector, we see this across many different industries, which is very unfortunate in my view as well. Let us talk about technology. I know you mentioned this earlier, but some of the recent technologies that we hear that are used in the agriculture sector are simply fascinating. They are experimenting about growing various food in the desert. Then there is this concept of vertical farming, where inside buildings, inside like a enclosed normal building with the right conditions being monitored, you are like growing food. They call it sometimes this lab grown food, and there is even research today to see whether we can grow food in space. What are the technological trends that you are marveled by nowadays?
Yeah, globally there is a lot of work being done in agtech area. Even in Sri Lanka we have seen a lot of it. There are sensor based agricultural innovations that have been brought in, where we can look at the soil conditions and look at what type of nutrition the plants require. You can map out various aspects of the soil and the growing conditions.
Just to share with you, I mean, if you look at some of the wineries, the vineyards, which are there in countries like France, famous for their wines, and they are nowadays, they use some kind of like sensor and Internet of Things infused technology, where the vineyard is monitored, the grapes are monitored using the technology, and the technology tells you when the time is right to really pluck it, when the bacteria has got infused at the right level, saying now is or today is the day to pluck these grapes and use for production.
Exactly, that is the level we have to aspire to move to, but Sri Lanka is doing some things already. For example, in greenhouse technology, in hydroponics, you can, for example, if you go to the supermarkets today, you see a lot of the lettuces of various varieties, the red lettuces, the greens one, which are all grown in greenhouse and done very well. And today what is quite interesting, Tarindu, is that there is a lot of focus going into the agtech space through innovation, and there are various types of startups that are coming up. And now, for example, as you might be aware, the Hatch organization, we are looking at making a Hatch Agri.
Oh, excellent.
So, which is to encourage agriculture into Hatch. A lot of innovative ideas are coming about, and those technologies out there, it's too numerous to mention, have really transformed agriculture. As you said, in Israel, the amount of the systems used, in Australia, even for packaging.
Food in the moon,
yes.
Growing food in the moon.
It's possible to do that. As long as you monitor, you have all the data, and we can use a lot of artificial intelligence as well in agriculture today. Use the data and look at what time to plant, when to harvest. Even in the packaging side, the very simple things that are now being used, color sorting, the sensory types of things to sort, divide your tomatoes and apples into various types of colors and ready to package straight into supermarkets. So, it is quite exciting, and Sri Lanka can get that, and we have a whole pool of intelligent people who traditionally did not come from the agriculture route. They are coming from IT, and they got quite interested in agri startups, and it is creating an innovation culture. It is just that we have to provide incentives, and I think it is a matter of time before it balloons and it takes off.
And we all also hear so many issues, especially with regard to some of these insect problems, for example, the Sena caterpillar and all that. But even for those, you think technology can sometimes provide the right solutions?
Yes, technology can provide the right solution, but sometimes because the magnitude of the infestation is large, you still have to rely a bit on the traditional ways using some form of chemical control. But technology is available. There are so many, lot of work already done with regard to solving problems like even the Sena caterpillar issue using modern
which
technology.
I believe is controlled now to a certain extent.
Yes, it has.
Good to hear that. Rizvi, on a final note, now this is something which we can talk in depth as well. Moving forward, what are the key sectors of agriculture in Sri Lanka that we should look at, especially from an export revenue opportunity, because we all know the dollars are short in supply. And yes, we have the traditional crops, the tea, the coconut and cinnamon, but are there other opportunities that we are missing out on? What is your advice? And please do take time and give your thoughts, because I know you are very passionate about this as well. What are the key agriculture subsectors, or maybe the key crops that Sri Lanka should look at in terms of an export revenue opportunity, especially moving forward from now on?
Sri Lanka has a whole slew of crops that we can work on, and I will come to them in a minute. The issue has been that we do not get regular consistent supply of those crops because of our production systems and the various issues that face our farmers or our growers or the exporters or the processors. So, we have to get that model right in terms of the growing. As mentioned in the beginning, this concept of nucleus farms, outgrowers is one model, and the other you see that happening even with some of our supermarkets that are doing an excellent job in working with farmers and growers and bringing product in a consistent way, because the supermarket cannot afford not to have the fresh produce, the vegetables. So, they work very closely in having a model to have consistent supply, creating the right value chains to bring fresh produce into the market. Now, that has to be replicated and is being replicated for export production. Now, export production of crops is an entirely different ball game, because we spend a lot of money in developing the products, in developing the customers globally, and then when we can't supply, it completely tarnishes the country's image, and then the whole concept of having export agriculture, and in particular in the current day value added export agriculture, comes down to naught. So,
when you say value added export agriculture versus the normal agriculture, so for example, just sending our black tea versus sending maybe some value added tea, is that what you are saying?
Exactly, yes. In the case of tea, that's the example, and Sri Lanka also I think is moving in the direction with in various forms like tea bags or tea extracts and other things, which are interesting things. But looking at some of the crops that you mentioned, which have got huge potential, particularly in the export segment, our fruit crops. For example, we used to export a huge amount of pineapples from Sri Lanka, because some of the varieties we grow here have got a particular demand because of the taste profile and the brix levels or the sweetness levels. But at a certain time, we couldn't get the right quantities to produce, and the costs also were very high. So, we have to focus on how do you get the supply chain, and it can be done. So, the key is to focus on high value added agricultural products that can go into global value chains. For example, apart from the traditional fruits and vegetables that are grown in Sri Lanka, there are of course the spices.
Yes.
And of course, the cinnamon. There is a marvelous amount of work being done with cinnamon. The spices are an attractive, if you can call it a niche, that can really be grown, that can balloon out and make a substantial impact in global markets. But I would still go back to the fruits and vegetables. Still a lot of work can be done. There are a whole lot of fruits and vegetables, the traditional pineapples, the papaya, even the banana. Some companies are doing even the dole from here, produced here. The dole company is doing Cavendish. So, similarly, we can do a lot of other crops which can be grown quite well here. Now, the value addition is an interesting part, either in dehydrated form in terms of the fruits or in terms of juices. And Sri Lanka has got many success stories of companies that have done that. It is just that we have to look at those successful practices and replicate them. The Key, however, is developing the whole value chain. Let me also talk about some interesting crops that Sri Lanka has started working on based on, as I said earlier, the grow to market paradigm.
Correct.
In the world, there is a huge emphasis now on what are called superfoods.
Superfoods, yes.
And even more lately, fueled by the COVID pandemic, people want immunity boosting foods, and those can come from a lot of the crops that we grow here, even in the fruits, etc. And there will be a huge demand. So, it must be in a value added form that can be shipped easily, can be consumed easily, either as a dehydrated or a concentrate. And some of these crops, for example, like Moringa powder is an exciting superfood in global markets, and it can really add value. Then even the jackfruit that we grow here, still we have to steam up the supply situation. It's very much a home garden product. We have to go towards getting it organized into commercial farms, and that goes back to the issue of land availability. We have to encourage people to do that. Mango is being grown now a lot of innovative done work with mango. So, similarly, these crops, although we will have competition from regional countries like India and Pakistan, etc., Sri Lanka can find its own niche, because we have gone to the world long before some of the regional countries, and we have good presence. The Sri Lanka tea is a good leader in terms of image. The Ceylon cinnamon now is being
a good torchbearer for our agriculture.
Exactly. So, similarly, if we get our act right, and when I go globally and visit all the fairs, the global fairs, etc., you see that there is a preference for the Sri Lankan brand, because we have a story to tell, and coupled with that, we can work heavily towards the organic certifications, and say that these are carefully produced, ethically produced products from Sri Lanka, value added products, and if we develop these market driven value change for about 5 agricultural crops, we are on the road to supporting other crops in Sri Lanka, and we can encourage farmers to make money, and there can be a lot of investment in it as well. So, this is, I am very excited and optimistic
about it,
that this can be developed into a huge industry in Sri Lanka.
Rizvi, I am going to give you just a minute, few words, just a minute to share some encouragement for any budding agri-entrepreneur who is watching this program.
I think they need to take the bullet and bite it, because particularly young people today, and I know even the farmers' children are getting enticed back, because they see combine harvesters being used, new technology coming in, drip system. So, for a young guy who is interested, even if you have not studied agriculture, even if you have studied IT, look for ways in which you can bring in your IT knowledge into agriculture, and it is quite exciting. The returns can be very interesting. You need simply to make use of all the tools, even artificial intelligence, the IoT, the various types of innovative products, but you have to do a bit of hard work, which is researching the markets.
Correct.
And today
you have said produce to the market.
Produce to the market. You have a lot of ways in which to research the market, use the internet, and today e-commerce is a thriving thing. For a young guy, you can easily package today you have, I can see a lot of guys, even for example in Jaffna, you get young guys who have done the Moringa powder as a Moringa tea bag. And they develop their own brand and exporting it to the UK and Europe. Yeah. So, a lot of interesting things happening, and I think there is a lot of prospects for young people. Don't look at it as being an agriculturist or a farmer. You are an agricultural entrepreneur. And you can, if you take that route, the world's your stage.
Rizvi Zaheed, thank you so much for being with us today, and I would like to wish you and your fellow agri-entrepreneurs in the Sri Lanka Agri-Entrepreneur Forum, wishing you good luck, and may you be able to revive this proud heritage of agriculture in Sri Lanka and keep up the good work. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Darren.
With that, we wrap up today's episode of Bisnomics. No matter what business you are in, stay safe, stay busy, and most importantly, stay profitable. I'll see you with the next episode.